out with the first question that really goes to the heart of the Rosenstrasse Civil Courage Foundation, and that's what does civil courage mean to you?
I think that civil courage means resistance to state violence broadly. And of course, there are other forms of civil courage that can be really important, and that other forms of kind of nonviolent resistance that may not always be directly up against the state, but against structures of power. And I think that typically where courage is required is where you are up against some kind of force that has control over how you navigate through your day-to-day life. And as we see the kind of structure of the nation state, that does tend to be the police or the federal government and federal law enforcement. And so, specifically in this moment, I think that civil courage means to me pushing back on a bloated, authoritarian prone executive. But it's important in my advocacy and also how I think about civil courage to make this not about one particular person, one particular political party, or one particular moment in our history, and instead to look at not just the kind of women that the Rosenstrasse Foundation honors in their protests, but to apply that in the United States to the many structures of state violence that remain unimpeded regardless of which political party is in power. And so we saw plenty of civil courage in the aftermath of not just the George Floyd murder, but also the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, the murder of Mike Brown, and throughout our history in the 60s and 70s. And I know that I personally take much of my own inspiration and guidance from anti-Vietnam War protesting, from the civil rights movement, and similar. And I think that that kind of resistance in the face of disproportionate power is always going to demand courage and the willingness to disrupt what you're told your life path is meant to be.
I think that's a really good point. We talk a lot about, we kind of use civil courage as this muscle. And in order to make systemic changes, it's this muscle that you have to keep flexing over and over. It becomes a way of life instead of just a singular act because, when you find community, when you're able to bring large groups of people together and really express that, I think that's when you see systemic change. So I think that's a really good point. Um, I think it kind of leads into the second question of, after you decided to resign from your law firm, I'm sure you saw many different paths and you chose to go into community organizing and gathering communities together to participate in this kind of resistance. What made you choose to do that over joining another law firm or maybe something that wouldn't be putting you as much in the direct line of fire, so to speak?
I think just to put a little bit of a fine point on what I'm doing for work now, I do work at a boutique law firm part-time that does primarily kind of anti-government overreach work, which was motivated in part by wanting to stay in an industry that I had spent many, many years and also a terrifying amount of money getting qualified to join, right, the legal industry. But the current role of community organizing came from kind of similar motivations to my what drove my resignation from Skadden, which was the desire to be proactive in the work that I was doing when I felt very confident as someone that paid attention in history class about and also paid attention to the things that the president is saying and Stephen Miller is saying and all of these other people. If you have a sense of the direction that we're headed in, then I think it's much more useful to be proactive and also very important, as you said, to continue to flex the muscle that is required for acts of resistance or defiance or disruption. And so I think that some of the decisions that I made related to my career immediately after resignation were really rooted in a cost benefit analysis related to what I had decided to give up and when. I think that people don't, it's very institutionalist and it's a little corporate for me to say that a lot of the decisions that I made are, and that I make and continue to make, are rooted in cost benefit analysis. But there's a kind of idea when protesters are talking about willingness to do actions that might lead to their arrest, and the thought of a civil disobedience arrest as a card that only gets played every X amount of days or weeks or months or years, depending on what the consequences are for people's arrest. It's a very bad idea to have a second civil disobedience arrest while the first one is being litigated, for example. And so when you think about playing a card that you know you only get to play one time, or like my resignation, or you only get to play with some degree of regularity that is not very frequent, like a civil disobedience arrest, there's a lot that goes into being strategic. Like there's a lot of strategy that goes into deciding when you play that card and how you play the game. And I had decided to leave a job that I certainly didn't think I was going to be in for forever, which was part of the cost benefit analysis, but to leave it earlier than I had planned and in such a way that made it pretty impossible for me to get a job within the same kind of subsection of the industry that I was already working in, by which I mean those kind of corporate law firms that are discussed as like the MLaw 100, the top earning law firms in the country. And so it did not feel worth it to me to resign for the sake of making a statement and then having that exist in a vacuum. It only really felt worth it to me to take that step if it was one strategic decision within a broader context of organizing. And so before I resigned, I had worked with a number of people across the industry on a kind of internal and external, but less confrontational pressure campaign from associates asking law firm partners to present a unified front in terms of their response to these executive orders, to sign on to amicus briefs in defense of Covington and Burling and Perkins Coie. Well, Covington never went to litigation, but Perkins Coie, which was litigating an executive order. And the decision to resign came as I realized that the heat needed to be raised in our advocacy pressuring the firms, and that I felt so strongly about it because I was concerned that it wasn't, the executive orders targeting law firms weren't being covered in a way that was accessible to non-lawyers, or that situated the actions correctly as an attack on kind of the broader legal system and not on specific firms or political adversaries, but instead using firms that had represented political adversaries to create a chilling effect on throughout the legal industry in terms of what cases particularly large firms would be willing to take on, which are not the bastions of impact litigation, but which often do provide significant resources and time and staffing for particularly complex impact litigation, or for things that until very recently would have been seen as uncontroversial direct services pro bono representation, like representing people in asylum court and other immigration postures. And so in order for it to be worth it for me to leave my job, I felt very strongly that the narrative had to be changed, right? Like that leaving the job was worth it if it could shift the way that media was talking about, and that the average American understood the law firm executive orders. And so in many ways, the decisions about what my next steps were made for me, because it wasn't worth it to quit unless I was also explaining to people doing media and similar. And I frankly expected that I would be doing a couple of interviews with industry publications and doing some explainers on social media. And instead, when I resigned, realized that the vast majority of news networks in the country had been waiting for anyone who was willing to go on television and explain what was happening through these executive orders. And so my next steps were a little bit dictated by the decision to take literally every interview that was offered to me over the course of the next probably 2 months. I did LSAT podcasts. I did YouTube shows that I had never heard of. And sometimes they ended up having a ton of people on them, and sometimes they ended up getting like 1,000 views. And at that point, my the likelihood of me going to another firm or even doing what I had anticipated doing, which was going to be an attorney for the city of Chicago or in-house corporate counsel at a nonprofit, those things no longer felt particularly possible in some instances because I had closed the doors through very direct political advocacy, and there are risk-averse employers that wouldn't want to hire. And in other cases, because I was still, to my surprise, getting many opportunities that felt useful to me in terms of explaining to people what was going on, and that required that I have more control over my own schedule than the vast majority of legal jobs with an employer provide you with. And so the decision to then step into more active community organizing, which is not my job because it is not compensating, in the city of Chicago, was made in the same way. Like, it didn't really feel like there was anything else I could do. I think that when you're situated so well, to have people listen to you and to have it taken seriously when you do disruptive action, I think that I wouldn't use the term obligation necessarily, but that's how it feels to me. When Donald Trump decided that Chicago was going to be one of the first targets in the kind of attempting virality, brutal public kind of campaign of ICE disappearances that we've now seen really spread across the country, it didn't feel like there was anything else to do because I was arrested outside of an ICE facility back in August. And 8 years ago, 10 years ago, the years there, it's difficult to confirm the year because it was reported in one place, but about a decade prior, outside of the same ICE facility during the Obama administration, 8 undocumented activists had been arrested protesting very similar things to what I was protesting about increased ICE disappearances and people being held overnight in a facility that was meant to be a processing station and thus was not set up with beds or showers or hygiene facilities. Those 8 people who bear far more risk than I do because they were undocumented activists were arrested, and it was in one news source. And when I was arrested, the views on the video that I made about it cumulatively got, I think, about 1.5 million views across that video, and it was in print in one of the German dailies. And so you can't, when you know that that's I think that a lot of people don't want to bear additional risk or even high risk. Their cost benefit analysis, often unintentionally, is this is worth it to me only if I can fix everything by myself. And it's a notion that kind of leans into toxic individualism and waiting for a hero. And it allows us to push off this sense that we owe each other more and that we should be willing to sacrifice more in the face of a government disappearing civilians off the streets based off of their race, rubber stamped by the Supreme Court, because that's where we find ourselves. And it will not remain just for race. It will extend to people based off gender identity. It will come for people who have abortions. And for me, I think I accepted a long time ago that you need a lot of people to take those actions and that there's never going to be one moment where an action is going to like dramatically change everything, but it might motivate other people to do the same thing. So the resignation was one of the rare experiences where it was actually, I think, really helpful for just me to do it. I'm very grateful to the other like 10 people who resigned publicly. I'm very grateful to people who left their firms in private and told their employers that was why they were leaving. But in general, you're not going to get a lot of instances where the good is largely in explaining to people because things are like so underreported. And so I think that moving to organizing, especially with the platform that had been built, felt like the only logical next step for me.
Before I touch on that more, I think I did see a lot of new names. So to explain why specifically the Rosenstrasse Foundation is so interested in this and add some historical context, the men who were rounded up in Rosenstrasse were rounded up to an assembly point. They were picked off the line while they were working by the Gestapo, the secret police, and taken there uh, with no warning. And when they got there, many people had to sleep on the floor. Um, it was not set up to house this many people. And the first day that they were rounded up, their wives simply showed up and tried to figure out where they were. And it was then the next day when they kind of telephoned, called, created this community that they were able to come together at this kind of this breaking point that they had, and they came together and they did this. So I think I'll let everyone draw the parallels that like themselves. But it's very striking. Um, when you're talking about this and you're talking about like the cost benefit analysis for the women of Rosenstrasse, it became clear they had nothing to lose but their husbands. So that was their kind of cost benefit analysis. Um, and I know you can't just give us a worksheet and have us fill out our own cost benefit analysis, but what would you say to people who want to do something? They feel so overwhelmed, but they don't even know how to start. They don't know what that cost benefit analysis looks like for them. Or you talk about people feeling like just these small actions don't have any big effect, so why even start? Um, what kind of what would you say to them? What would you kind of encourage for them to do?
The question that I like to ask myself is I like to sit with my own self-conception. And I refer to this as kind of a self-mythology, right? I think all of these things about myself. I think I am a principled person. I think that I am willing to give things up for safety and security of other people. And my lines are probably not in the same place, are certainly not in the same place as a lot of other people. I Some of that is because of just risk that I am personally willing to bear, right? I went into big law in the first place because I wanted to buy a condo. I wanted to rebuild my savings. I'm not really someone that, in general, particularly prior to the current Trump administration, would be willing to give up extreme levels of not, or would be willing to give up medium levels of stability, financial stability and comfort if that's accessible to me, right? And so, but I am someone and had always felt that I was someone that did not feel that I needed much more than that. I remember that one of the most radicalizing moments about concepts of extreme wealth in this country for me was when I started making $200,000 a year as a starting salary at a large law firm and paying off about $170,000 in student loans and wondering what people were using to justify needing significantly more money than that, right? And also understanding that I don't have children, understanding that that I'm not supporting my extended family. So I'm not saying that's like a fixed number. It's just that a lot of people, when you go into that industry, if you ask them, what do you want for yourself? They say some degree of financial comfort. And then 10 years later, what they're saying that entails, the financial comfort, requires that they be able to send their children to private schools that ensure that they're never speaking to anyone from a different income bracket. And that's why they need to continue in this particular industry, because that's what financial stability is. And those things slip and they slide. And I think that when I was asking myself, how do I think of myself? I come up with a kind of definition. Where are my lines in a vacuum? Where are my lines? What is my cost benefit analysis? What would I be willing to give up for in order to resist an authoritarian regime that's clearly telegraphing that it wants to put people in work camps? Because that is not just what we're facing, but what is already happening across the country. There's so many people that are unaccounted for. And then once I have that in my head, I have to ask myself, so if that's the type of person that I am, would I be acting in the way that I am now, or would I be changing my behavior? How would that person act? And I don't think that it is doing nothing. And then to your first question that I'm answering is your second question, to the idea of what do I do if I feel very overwhelmed and I don't know where to start. I think that many people who are not directly impacted by state violence, usually myself very much included, because I think that covers the majority of white people in this country, it's easy to feel now like there's something really new that's happening. And in many ways, that's true. But on the flip side of that, there are structures that have been built out in community organizations and mutual aid and all of these things, primarily in Black and Latina communities over the last many decades. The rapid response groups that exist in LA in particular did not originate in response to the Trump administration, but to increase, or Trump 2.0, but to increased and widespread immigration enforcement in certain neighborhoods in Los Angeles for a very long time. And so those kinds of structures, which also in turn are then reminiscent of resistance structures in authoritarian regimes and are the seeds for resistance structures for more widespreadly authoritarian regimes, and a necessary predicate that also remain useful even if we do not continue down this path, because they provide things like grocery deliveries and support for neighbors where the state has failed them. Those structures in large cities in the country generally already exist in Black and Brown communities and need support and amplification and resources and volunteers. And where they don't exist in a specific place or in a specific part of a city, there are so many resources written by the same kind of Black and Brown organizers to explain how you build them. And there's so many case studies. And so I would say that looking into rapid response and mutual aid in and the structures and organizations that were supportive of 2020 protests is always going to be a good place to start, as is writing from abolitionist organizers in particular, whether or not you agree with underlying theory around abolition of prisons and policing. Those are the organizations that have been resisting really ingrained and legal state violence in this country for a long time. And so they are the place to start in terms of understanding one's own organizing.
I think it's interesting. You really make the point that resistance is not a new concept. Unfortunately, authoritarianism is not a new concept. Um, and my thought is always, in some ways, this is nothing new. It might be new to us, but it is not a new concept. But it is kind of our job to, as we look back and we look at these writings and the actions of others, of creating that for now, so that when future generations look back and history is incredibly cyclical, they can look back and see what we're doing and improve upon that, just like we're improving upon the past. My last question before I kind of open it up to the audience is you talk a lot about these communities of people that are coming together. I think a lot of people feel very isolated, especially after COVID. How do you find these communities? How do you build these communities? Um, what can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that on the whole, and this is said with it's something I say on social all the time, you find them by logging off for the most part and showing up. And I agree with you deeply that we are very, very isolated from each other, particularly post COVID quarantine, and that it's a necessary predicate for the situation that we find ourselves in, for the most part, is that isolation because it breeds exhaustion and apathy. And it also makes it much easier to make people afraid of strangers. And so, in the kind of many of the people that I am close with in my life, I have met through organizing and through protest. I would not say that it is a majority, but it's people that it's something that has been present throughout my life, whether that is organizing electorally, whether that is, I co-host a YouTube show with a friend of mine that I know through organizing in at Planned Parenthood when we were like 23, some moons ago at this point, around codifying access to abortion in the state of Rhode Island. And so I think that showing up, especially to small protests, I think that sometimes people think that when I'm saying, you got to show up to the events, they imagine something like a No Kings March where it's not super likely that you're going to meet a bunch of new friends at that, just because there's so many people that are there and it's not set up as a community building activity for the most part. But what I really mean is that there are so many rapid response groups, there are so many mutual aid organizations, there are so many community organizations and progressive or leftist book clubs and campaign events right now because we're going into the midterms for progressive candidates. And so I think that it becomes very intimidating to go into those spaces. And I would be the first to admit that they are not always as welcoming as they should be, and they can feel very insular. And if you show up to a space and that's how it feels, I'm of the opinion always that that space is not really a liberatory space, honestly, because part of liberatory work is making sure that people have community and that they can plug in and are welcome. And it doesn't mean you get along with everybody all the time and you're Pollyanna-y, but it does mean that it shouldn't feel like really awkward to walk into the space for the first time. And so, in general, there's this kind of oft maligned idea of joy is resistance being incorrect because it's co-opted a lot of the time by people who are not suffering the harms of the government, using that to justify why they are not paying attention or showing up or participating. But in reality, liberatory joy is resistance because it comes through community building and plugging in. And one of my favorite anecdotes from the whole last year, honestly, is being at a fairly confrontational protest outside of an ICE facility in the city of Chicago with two of my best friends who had come in, many who I did not meet through organizing, and then leaving that protest to go engagement ring shopping for my best friend who had been at the protest with me, and thinking about the balance that exists in how our life and our friendship is rooted in but not exclusively about, because it never could be, ideas of liberation and learning and showing up and community building. And I think that one of the great compliments that I ever receive is from people who are varying degrees of close to me, telling me about ways that they have felt motivated to be community members or better community members because of things that we've talked about or conversations that they've seen me kind of, most of my social media presence is just distilling down the conversations that I've had with my friends into a summary that then I put out onto the internet once the ideas have been refined. But I think that we really have to take back the idea that, or fight this idea that the right has won for right now and admit that they've won it. That's something else that we're not very good at a lot of the time. The right has convinced people that, not even like particularly far left protester, but just anybody who votes blue is like a joyless, word policing, political correct shill. And it's so deeply untrue, and managed to convince them that instead the most joyful thing to do is to watch incel streamers talk about how, you know, the sorry, I watched the Piers Morgan Nick Fuentes interview earlier today for to prep for this thing that I'm trying to write. And so it's very top of mind, but I can't only give those examples. But that the joyful thing to do is to like hate everybody and have no friends. And I think that it's a narrative that if we apply ourselves at even a little bit, we can pretty effectively fight off, as long as we're building actual joyful community spaces, because it is a lot more fun to not be like so hateful. But
Thank you. Before I turn off the recording and hand it over, I to the group, I think that that's a really important idea is this joy as resistance and community as resistance and finding the joy. Because it's miserable to be miserable. Um, and finding these communities can lead to this collective action. And I think that protests that I've been to, organizing groups that I've been to, even the foundation and the meetings we have, especially back in Tallahassee with other students, are some of the most joyous events. Yes, the topics are hard, um, but to be able to find solace in each other and finally feel like you're doing something that act can be incredibly joyous. Um, Thank you very much. I'm going to stop.